Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. Pay careful attention to the italic bold words at the end. And when they departed, here's our story. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. Verse 14. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt. Verse 15. Pay careful attention now.
Careful attention.
And was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Out of Egypt have I called my son. If you had a Christian study Bible, there would be a footnote there. And it would tell you that this passage, in fact, can be found in the book of Hosea, chapter 11. This passage, in fact, in the Jewish scriptures. You should know that this verse, in fact, this passage quoted...
Yes, he is quoting the KJV, by the way, for those in the chat room. Yes, he is quoting all of Tovia constantly goes to the KJV. I think that's because that's probably what was quoted to him when he was growing up.
Matthew does appear in the book of Hosea, in Sefer Hosea. It's there. But for some reason, Matthew does something that's striking. He only quotes a very small part of the original passage that appears in Sefer Hosea in the book of Hosea. And the question is why? Ordinarily, if you quote a verse, you quote it in its entirety. Why would you quote only one segment of the original passage? The answer to that question is simple. Matthew, meaning whoever wrote it, had no choice. He had to quote only the last segment of the original passage, because had Matthew quoted the passage, the verse from Hosea in its entirety, it would become immediately obvious to the reader of the Christian Bible that this verse in no way is referring to the Messiah, but is referring to something else entirely different.
Chapter 11. When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and called my son out of Egypt. When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and called my son out of Egypt. When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and called my son out of Egypt. When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and called my son out of Egypt. When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and called my son out of Egypt. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Baalim, and burned incense to graven images.
The firstborn, conceptually, is the bridge between one generation and the next. If you don't have a firstborn, you don't have a next generation. You may have lots of children after the firstborn, but the firstborn represents a bridge, and what the firstborn does is carry the life and the values of the parent to the next generation. What happens to the firstborn of Egypt? They die, which means that the values and the life of the Egyptian systems symbolically has been destroyed. There is no link to another generation. I mean, there are more Egyptians, don't get me wrong, but symbolically the firstborn is gone, so symbolically the link between the old generation, worshiping all these gods and so forth, and the next generation has been destroyed. Egypt, in that sense, does not go forward. Out of that is born God's firstborn, Israel. And if it's the job of the firstborn to carry out the life and the values of the parent, what is Israel's job? To carry on the life and the principles of God. Yes, they're the firstborn. Israel is God's firstborn. And the reason he chooses the term as firstborn is because they are the bridge between the father and the next generation, or in this case, the world. So Egypt's firstborn dies, which means that the Egyptian system symbolically is cut off. It's destroyed. And what then goes forward is God's firstborn. And oh, by the way, if you look at that door and you have a bloody door that the firstborn comes through, what does that sound like to you? Birth, doesn't it? So Israel, God's firstborn, is born through that bloody door and comes out into the world through the birth canal. It's all designed symbolically, if you will, to show the death and the end of one system and the birth and the beginning of the next. So in that sense, you have the 10 statements of creation, you now have 10 statements of destruction, and then you will have the 10 statements of rebirth, if you will, where Israel stands at the foot of the mountain and receives the 10 words from God, the legacy from their father that they're to carry on to the next generation.
I am Morpheus. Welcome to the real world.